Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a look at the world of medieval labor. It's a rough and dirty world, but it's also full of glory. It was a time when your job title said less about your career path and more about how likely you were to catch the plague or get burns. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the bright lights and turn on a fan for a soft background hum. Let's start tonight's journey gently. Let's say you were born in medieval England and you didn't have big career ambitions. You don't want to be a knight because you're too easily offended. You don't want to be a monk because that would be too quiet. So, you take the path of least resistance. You become a gong farmer. Just so you know, gong is not a musical instrument here. It's actually a medieval word for poo. A gong farmer was the lucky person who got to remove it from toilets, cesspits, and privies. These were the places where medieval people relieved themselves after a hearty meal of turnips and regret. You worked at night, not because the job was mysterious, but because it stank so much that the townsfolk preferred not to be reminded of you during the day. You arrived with a shovel and a bucket, and maybe some dignity left. You went down into the pit, which sometimes went down as far as the waist deep, and sometimes further depending on how much the town had produced. The good news is that gong farmers were actually paid well, sometimes more than carpenters or thatchers. The bad news is that you earned every coin while being shamed by the community for centuries. Now, health and safety weren't exactly priorities in the 1300s. Cesspits could collapse. Methane could catch fire. There are recorded cases of gong farmers passing out from fumes, slipping into the muck, and dying in what can only be described as the worst obituary ever written. For working, he needed a wooden bucket, a long-handled scoop, and sometimes a donkey to pull the cart out of town. The waste was then put in special areas for the animals to rest or used as fertilizer because, let's face it, nothing says organic farming like medieval bowel movements. People did not socialize with gong farmers. You weren't invited to the banquets, but some people did find that they liked spending time with other people who collected night soil. They probably talked about who had the worst day. You didn't get used to the smell. You just stopped complaining about it. In the end, it became part of who you were. So, even though the gong farmer may not have been a swordsman or worn a fancy hat, they still made sure medieval cities didn't flood because of their waste. They were the hidden heroes of cleaning, working with one bucket at a time. And if that sounds bad, don't worry. It gets worse. If you don't like city life, this might not be the job for you. Do you want to go somewhere more natural, outdoorsy, and where you might see wildlife? Well done. You've just become a leech collector. The medieval worker who was proud of his job. He spent his days walking through bogs to collect small insects. The job description was simple. Go into a pond, stand very still, and let leeches attach themselves to your legs. That's it. You are the bait. You attract them by being warm, having a poor lifestyle, and looking like you don't care. When the slimy creatures latch on, you can pull them off and put them in a jar. Keep going until you feel faint from blood loss. Then head home for a nap and an infection. This wasn't just a job for a few people. People used to use leeches to treat illnesses, especially by letting people bleed. Feeling headachy? Download it. Sadness? Let's make you unhappy. Plague? You just need a little less blood. Barber surgeons loved leeches like modern influencers love ring lights. They were very important, and that meant someone had to collect thousands of them. Now it's your turn. The walking shoestring board of the swamp. Do you need protective clothing? Not really. Most collectors worked without shoes and with no socks on. This is often the case for women or people who don't have much money. The girls who were lucky enough to have a skirt on were the ones who got to go. The unlucky ones had welts. And if you were really unlucky, You'd come home with leeches still attached, growing plump and smug beneath your knees. And the dangers weren't just limited to blood-sucking. These weren't clean garden ponds. We're talking about muddy, stagnant water. It's full of bacteria, frogs, and sometimes geese who are looking at you like they think you're doing something wrong. You risk tetanus, trench foot, and trench shame. As for payment, you got a few coins per dozen leeches, maybe food, but mostly you got the satisfaction of contributing to the art of bloodletting and the slow-motion downfall of patient health. The good news is that it's pretty unlikely you'll get mugged on the way home. No one wanted to get that close. You've already tried working with human waste and dealing with parasites in a pond. So, you're wondering what the next step in this really tough career path might be. But what about burying the victims of the Black Death? That's right. You, dear viewer, are now a plague carrier. Because in medieval times, death was an unavoidable part of life. This job had 3 main requirements. You just need a shovel, a strong stomach, and to not care about your personal safety. Or protective gear. At best, you might have a cloth soaked in vinegar tied to your face. If things got really bad, you could only rely on your own positive attitude and some garlic, which someone had told you would keep away bad spirits. When the plague hit in the mid-4th century, people were quick to accuse witches without thinking. Entire neighborhoods emptied overnight. Dead bodies were strewn across the streets, houses, and churches. Someone had to move them. That someone became your daily office, whether it was mass graves or plague pits. You'd spend hours digging trenches wide enough to throw in entire families. Sometimes there weren't even coffins, just body parts wrapped in cloth. And sometimes they had a chicken with them to symbolize good luck. Or maybe you just wandered in. And don't expect them to be grateful. People stayed away from you. If you showed up in the marketplace, everyone suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. People thought that you were bad luck, smelt bad, and could make people sick. A medieval triple threat. Now, there was always more to do. There are no weekends or holidays off. The plague didn't stop, and neither did you. The worst part was that you knew that every day at work was a gamble. Many barriers became what they buried, especially after a sneeze or cough in the wrong direction. Compensation. In theory, the town council might give you some money or stale bread. In practice, you often got paid for your continued existence. On the plus side, there was a sense of grim purpose. You stopped cities from collapsing under the sheer weight of death. But let's not make it seem more romantic than it is. You were basically playing Tetris with corpses while wondering if that weird itch on your arm was just fleas or something more sinister. Welcome to the exciting world of medieval textile production, where fashion and fermentation came together, and you, the humble fuller, made sure nobody's wool tunic felt like a cactus. What job are you in? The answer is simple. Soak some cloth in human urine, then stamp on it until it feels soft enough to be used as clothing and not medieval sandpaper. Raw wool is oily, stiff, and it sticks to everything like glue. To turn into fabric that can be worn, it needed to be tricked. The process involves soaking the cloth in a strong mixture of water, earth, and, yes, urine. Why? Human pee that has not been changed for a long time contains ammonia, which helps clean and soften the fibers. Why did you have to stomp on it for hours? This was because machines hadn't been invented yet, and your feet were seen as God's gift to the medieval textile industry. This wasn't a light-hearted toe dip. You were in a vat of liquid, kneeling down and hitting the fabric with your feet. It was as if you were a winemaker who had made a big mistake in planning their career. You didn't just stomp once or twice. You did this for hours every day for years. You basically lived in a state of medieval woe and regret. The stench legend. So much so that places where people could go to have fun without getting too drunk were built far away from towns. This was not because of zoning regulations, but because people did not like the smell of your profession being too close. Now, let's talk about health. Your body was in constant pain from trench foot, ammonia burns, and rashes with strange names like God's curse. If your shoes get really wet, they'll probably dissolve by the end of the week. When it came to social standing, Fullers didn't headline feasts. You were tolerated like rats in the pantry or that one cousin who won't stop talking about herbal medicine. But there was some job security. People always needed clothes, and wool was the most important material. As long as people were happy, healthy, and wanted to look a bit more like humans, you were needed. But what are the risks? You weren't making high-end designer clothes. You were soaking your toes in other people's bodily fluids, hoping no one ever asked you what you did for a living over dinner. But things went wrong from there. Let's say you've had enough of fluids, body or otherwise, and want a job that's dry. Technically, well done. You've just been given a promotion to treadwheel operator, the proud worker inside a giant wooden hamster wheel. But instead of getting a treat at the end, you get long-term joint pain, and you start to think about life's big questions. You mostly worked on building cathedrals. You lifted huge stones up high with your legs. You didn't care about hurting your back. Picture a crane, but the motor is just you walking in circles like a confused pilgrim. In the Middle Ages, engineers had the idea of taking a giant wheel, putting a person in it, and pretending that physics wouldn't matter. And so, the treadmill crane was created. The wheel was often suspended high above the ground, so you weren't just walking in a wheel. You were walking on a wheel 40 feet in the air, lifting stones heavier than all your family put together. Do you lose your footing? It's like gravity takes over. It's not a building site anymore. It's a funeral that was arranged at the last minute. The rhythm of your day, walk some more. Sometimes, stop and let someone put bread in your hand. Then keep walking. The wheel makes a noise, the rope is worn, and your knees start to hurt. And if your colleague in the next car gets too excited and starts going too fast, that's a problem. Suddenly, you're in a really hard medieval spin class. There are no safety standards. You were lucky if the axle didn't break. Sometimes someone forgot to properly secure the counterweight, and loads of stone crash down. This is a metaphor for what can happen to your career. Was the pay good? Not really. You were paid just to not get crushed today, which back then was a pretty decent benefits package. You might get some stew at the end of the shift if you still had enough energy to hold a spoon. But you were part of something very big, like a cathedral, a monument to faith, art, and how ambitious people were. People would be amazed by it for hundreds of years, but probably never think about the human will hamster who carried the stones into place, complaining about his sore ankles. But at least you weren't stomping wool and pee anymore. Progress. So, you're tired of walking in circles and lifting rocks the size of marital regret. Maybe you want something with more movement, more drama, and the risk of being bitten by something dangerous. Welcome to the glamorous life of a rat catcher. The unsung hero of keeping the city clean, if you know what a hero is. Rats were everywhere in medieval times. They were found in grain stores, infested taverns, and overrun castles. Basically, they just lived in buildings where they could get into rats. The answer to this problem wasn't to use poison traps or science. It was you, a person with a net, a dog, and a blank stare that says, "I've seen things." Your average day involved crawling through dark, cramped spaces under buildings, chasing rats with nothing but your hands or a small club. Sometimes you used ferrets, sometimes terriers, and sometimes you just couldn't take it anymore. All the while, try not to get bitten, scratched, or sneezed on by the people that you'll meet on your walk. And let's be clear, these weren't Disney employees baking pies in someone's kitchen. These were rats that were carrying diseases and the plague. They were also very angry. These rats were from medieval times. They survived on rubbish, fought each other for food, and probably had better health insurance than you. The things they needed to do their job included a burlap sack, a torch, and possibly some boiled leather gloves that offered about as much protection as a soggy napkin. If you were lucky, you had a dog that had been trained to sniff out nests. If you were unlucky, you had a torch and a lot of yelling. Hey, let's just say that no one's getting rich by chasing rats. You might get a few coins per tail. Yes, it was a game of chance. This meant that you had to bring proof of your rat conquest, like a medieval loyalty program. Sometimes, towns would hire rat catchers during outbreaks, especially when people noticed a lot of dead rats and fleas. But once the panic died down, the budget and public respect were as low as a puddle. No one wanted to sit near you, talk to you, or hear about your day. But deep down, everyone was happy you were there because without you, the rats would take over the world, or at least the food cupboard. Let's say you want to work indoors. Maybe you like kids. Maybe you dream of a life of romance, wearing silk robes and eating food that wasn't boiled in sadness. So, you get a job in the palace, looking after a young noble. Sounds easy, right? No, that's not right. You're the scapegoat, the living punishment proxy. To sum it up, the prince misbehaves. You get whipped. Yes, that was a real job. Noble children, especially royal children, were seen as too important to be physically punished. You can't hurt the future king just because he fed gunpowder to the cat. Instead, they chose another child, often of lower status, to be his constant companion. If the prince broke the rules, you would get lashes in front of him while he watched. Hopefully he would feel guilty, but usually he would just be eating snacks. It was a strange way of getting other people to do the moral part of the job. You were supposed to be so close to the prince that he would feel bad watching you get flogged. It's a cute theory, unless you were dealing with a tyrant who thought your screams sounded like music. You spent the day watching the royal child at school, at mealtimes, riding, and practicing swordplay. You were his friend, someone he could study with, and on bad days, someone he could blame. If he was rude to his teacher, he got the cane. He didn't pass his Latin class. I hope you like bruises. He threw a tantrum. I'm going to have to start limping. There was no career path either. You didn't become the scapegoat or the person who gets punished. You just reached the age where you are no longer eligible, assuming you survived without your spine permanently bending. Surprisingly, some of the people who were whipped as children ended up becoming lifelong friends with the royals who whipped them. After all, nothing brings two kids closer together than having the same memory of one being beaten for the other's bad behavior. Others, however, were not recorded. They probably went into the woods and decided that being friends can hurt. They received pay, a room, food, and maybe the occasional thank you note. No one built a statue to a whipping boy. But if you were lucky, you got to wear clean clothes and eat from the prince's table before being beaten up for his food fight. You were fed up of rat bites and being beaten up. You want to be alone, enjoy the fresh air, and have a job that doesn't involve looking after children or animals. Then, add the lime burner. A man so committed to breathing in dust that he made chimney sweeps look like people who take wellness supplements. What job are you in? Burn limestone in a very hot kiln to make quicklime, which is a key ingredient in mortar, plaster, and farming. And there's a fun twist. Corpses. That's right. Quicklime was sometimes used in burials to speed up the process of rotting. Your work was all over the place. On walls, in fields, and even Uncle Jeffrey, who was slowly disappearing behind the church. The process involved building a large oven called a lime kiln by layering limestone, fuel, wood, peat, or if you were trying to be eco-friendly, dried dung. Then you would light it and bake it at very high temperatures for several days. And when I say you, I mean you stood next to it, putting materials on it, and sometimes poking it with a long stick like some medieval pizza chef. If a pizza exploded in your lungs and set your tunic on fire, breathing near a lick of limestone was a bit like hugging a volcano while snorting chalk. The fumes were toxic, the dust was everywhere, and there was always the risk of the materials catching fire. A quick gust of wind, and you were coughing up pieces of masonry while your eyebrows disappeared. Protective equipment, huh? If you were lucky, you had a rag over your mouth, and if you were really lucky, you had a pair of wooden clogs. Gloves, please. Your hands had become so hard that they could have been used as armor. Even worse, quicklime reacts quickly with water. If it rained or you sweated too hard, the powder could hiss, bubble, and burn straight through your skin. There's nothing quite like being slowly worn down by your own job. There's little social life. You smelled like scorched earth, looked like a haunted chimney, and your lungs made noises like a dying accordion. But there's a bright side. People respected your work. You made the foundations of buildings and sometimes helped dig plague pits. That's basically a CV. But every time you changed, you got closer to becoming a pile of dust. Let's say you want a job where you can choose your own hours, enjoy the outdoors, and don't have too much supervision. You don't mind working nights, you don't like authority, and you aren't squeamish about corpses. Well done. You would be perfect for a job as a resurrectionist or grave robber. But not just any grave robber. You're not stealing rings or gold teeth. No, you're after the whole body. This is for science, obviously. It's all very academic. Don't worry about the shovel and the lack of soul. In the late medieval period, medical schools started asking for human bodies to be used for dissection. The problem? The church did not approve of dissecting bodies, and it was very difficult to get legal permission to use a corpse. You are the resurrectionist, the person who helps connect the dots between the person who has been buried and the person who is learning about the human body. You used to dig up recently buried bodies in the cemetery, secretly and before the body was too decayed. You worked fast like a speedrunner, often with a partner. One to dig, one to keep watch, and both to pretend you weren't about to yank a grandparent out of retirement. You didn't think about coffins. It was too heavy and too loud. You would smash open the lid, pull out the body, and leave the valuables behind sometimes. You said it wasn't theft. It was like science, but not quite. Obviously, not everyone was happy with the work you did to help medicine get better. Some people who were happy were your family, the church, and the local police. If caught, you could be fined, sent to prison, or even publicly shamed, though it is rare for this to result in execution, which seems strange given the number of corpses you have handled. Some towns began putting dangerous traps on graves. These included iron cages, heavy stones, and explosive devices. Yes, really, a spring-loaded jaw trap is the perfect way to make sure your feet are always kept safe. But people kept wanting it. Doctors needed cadavers, and you were cheaper than a legal alternative. Sometimes you even had a standing order. One adult male, relatively intact, no visible plague. You get paid quite well, especially since you don't need any training other than being able to use a shovel and be dead inside. You earn more money than most people saw in a month. Ah, yes, the groom of the stool. The job that shows that even though court life may look glamorous, someone still has to deal with the king's exit strategy. If you're wondering whether the title is a metaphor, it isn't. Your job is to help the king when he is on the toilet. And what about your job? Help him wipe. Take a moment to think about that. This wasn't just some silly medieval trick that got out of hand. No, it was a well-respected position. The groom of the stool was often a nobleman, and the king trusted him completely. When you've seen someone naked, sweating, and breathing heavily, you've achieved a level of intimacy that few people can match. You didn't just use fabric. You had power. You were the only one who could go into the king's room during his meetings when he was sitting down. You were in charge of his clothes, letters, and even gave advice on rules. It was a strange relationship between them. You were both the royal cleaner and the person closest to the king. The job required discretion, loyalty, and a really strong stomach. You might also be in charge of getting the stool ready, making sure the privy linens were fresh and keeping the royal bottom powdered, perfumed, and presentable. In the Middle Ages, kings didn't just rule, they also had very stylish toilets. Of course, you promised to keep it secret. If he leaked royal bowel movements to the tavern crowd, it would ruin his career and possibly even get him killed. But as court gossip was always full of information, your knowledge of the king's diet and digestive habits made you a walking medical report. And surprisingly, people liked you a lot. As bad as it sounds, the job paid well. You lived in luxury, ate at the king's table, and sometimes received land or titles, all because you were very important to the royal family. But it's hard to brag at parties. Oh yes, I'm the reason the king doesn't get sore. Is it not quite as fancy as knight or chancellor? So, you think you're a chef in the Middle Ages. That's really sweet. Forget Michelin stars. You want to make a meal that is not harmful to anyone. In the medieval era, your role as a cook was not about creating fancy meals, but rather about preventing people from getting sick from bad food. You weren't using the freshest ingredients. You were working with the least rotten ones, the stuff that smelled mostly fine and only twitched occasionally. Your tools included a giant cauldron, a wooden spoon the size of a battle axe, and a blazing fire that either burned your stew or your eyebrows. Sometimes both. Recipes, please. In the Middle Ages, people would usually write a recipe like, take meat, boil it, add a handful of herbs, pray. The quantities were vague, the instructions were even vaguer, and if someone complained, you just told them it was peasant style. Working in a noble household meant that food had to be kept fresh and ways to hide spoilage had to be found. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't used for flavor. They were for masking the taste of doom. If the meat still moved, you just added more saffron. The problem's been solved. Poultry had feathers until just a few minutes ago. Hopefully, the fish are not blinking. Everything else was thrown away. It was a simple meal, just vegetables, barley, and bits of meat cooked together in one pot. The real horror, however, was feast day. There were hundreds of guests and dozens of dishes, all being prepared in a kitchen that was dark and smoky, and where the ceiling was covered in grease. The dogs licked the floor and sometimes the food, and one kitchen boy was always disappearing for some unknown reason. You were responsible for the small details, like the sculptures made of sugar or meat that were shaped like swans, dragons, or saints. That's right, you had to make a saint out of pastry and still find time to boil 50 cabbages. If it collapsed, guess who would be blamed? Not St. John the Melty, that's for sure. Burns, cuts, infections, and food poisoning were all part of the job. There was no refrigeration, no health inspector, and no sympathy when the Lord's pigeon pie exploded. Even so, if you managed to not poison anyone important enough, you might be able to keep your job for now. Born appetite. So, you don't mind working hard. Maybe you enjoy being outside. Maybe you think that lifting heavy things will make your biceps as big as the ones you see on church frescoes. Welcome to the life of a quarryman, where your job is to fight rocks, and the rocks usually win. In medieval times, a quarryman's day started before sunrise and ended when he was too tired to work anymore. Your job is to cut, smash, and carry huge pieces of stone out of the ground using only basic tools and a lot of physical effort. There are no complicated tools, just hammers, chisels, and wedges, and a strong personal dislike of granite. You would start by hammering iron spikes into natural cracks in the rock to split it, which worked if you hit the same spot hard enough, often enough, while your hearing slowly got worse. For extra fun, you could pour cold water into hot cracks to try and shock the stone apart. If your job is in thermodynamics, it's a bad sign if something has gone wrong. There's dust everywhere in your lungs, your teeth, your bread. Safety goggles hadn't been invented yet, so you squinted and hoped that today wouldn't be the day a rogue flake of limestone would get into your eye. But the best part is yet to come. cave-ins, and falling slabs. One wrong tap, and you could start a chain reaction of screaming and running around, which would end with a very awkward workers' compensation hearing. Back then, it was just a priest saying, well, he died doing what he hated. What's in it for you? A few coins, a sore back, and the knowledge that your stones might one day become a cathedral, a dungeon, or a privy wall. If you were lucky, you would be sent to work on quarries near limestone or sandstone, which are soft rocks. If not, you might find yourself chipping away at granite, which is about as forgiving as a tax collector with a hangover. It's a bit like a background character, but not quite, and not a local ghost story either. I'm only interested in romance if someone loves dirt and coughs a lot. But hey, at least you didn't work inside. So, you think you've got a good cardio routine? Imagine what it was like to be a messenger during the war in the Middle Ages. It was a job that involved running long distances, dealing with important international relations, and the constant risk of being mistaken for an enemy spy, as well as experiencing really bad luck. Your job description was simple. Get military information across a large area where there are enemies without getting hurt or caught. Imagine you were a medieval USB stick, but with worse encryption and a much higher chance of being destroyed. Speed was very important. You had to move quickly enough to outrun horses, outsmart bandits, and sometimes shout the phrase, "Don't kill me, I work here," in different languages. If you couldn't run, you rode. But horses made you more visible, and in a war zone, visibility was not a good thing unless you were a flag. Your deliveries, battle orders, secret troop movements, surrender demands, or awkward letters explaining why the king's reinforcements were 3 weeks late and very drunk. If they catch you, they might torture you to make you talk. If you're caught by your own side during uniform change, you might be mistaken for a spy and be killed before you can say, "I'm on the wrong side." Sorry, the weather didn't matter. You were expected to gallop through storms, mud, snow, or scorching sun. Make sure your scroll doesn't get wet or dirty, because if it does, it'll be really hard to read. Sometimes you delivered messages during the battle itself, moving quickly between the fighting lines to tell one commander that the left side of their army had either collapsed or gone off to look for lunch. The archers didn't care. The cavalry couldn't see you. Everyone else was too busy attacking each other to hear. Please don't skewer the guy with the parchment. And if you survive the delivery, guess what? You have to go back. Hey, not bad. If you were fast, quiet, and could sense danger. There's a slightly higher chance of survival than if you were thrown like a catapult, but only a little bit higher. But even though it was dangerous, the job had something special about it. You were the person who kept the different armies working together, the one who spoke for the kings, and the guy who ran while everyone else hid. Carrying bad news at full speed is the ultimate hero move. The blacksmith. The medieval town's human furnace, part craftsman, part magician, and full-time sweat fountain. If you could make metal glow like the sun, and then hit it with a hammer until it was all bent out of shape, you were the person for the job. Your workspace is a fiery hot place, filled with soot, sparks, and enough noise to scare off any notion of peace. You didn't need a rooster to wake the whole village. Just the loud, rhythmic clanging sound of your daily metal opera. Blacksmiths made everything. Horseshoes, plowshares, swords, nails, armor, hinges, and about 600 other objects that people broke every week, and they all wanted them yesterday. Oh, blacksmith, my ox has lost a shoe. Oh, great hammer holder, my gate hinge squeaks. I need a new sword. This one bends too easily. Everyone loved you until you made them pay. Then they remembered that Brother Thomas makes nails on the side. Your body was covered in scars, and one of your ears was burnt off. Your dominant arm was roughly the size of a tree trunk. Romantic prospects weren't bad. You had muscles and permanent coal eyeliner, But it was hard to have a chat when every sentence was followed by you coughing and a mysterious burst of flames from behind you. Let's talk about danger. Red-hot metal, sparks flying, iron cracking instead of bending, anvils that don't care about your toes, and bellows that sometimes catch fire. If you're not paying attention, your beard can quickly go from being a beard to a candle. And if you worked for a castle or army, congratulations. Now you're making lots of weapons for men who solve disagreements with axes. I hope you like it when someone makes you meet a deadline. But even so, the blacksmith was very important. You were the technology expert in the town, the person everyone turned to when they needed help. Long before there were engineers, you were designing tools. Long before influencers, you were already setting trends. You made things that people needed to survive and sometimes look impressive while doing it. But you never got statues. It's just more broken metal, and a customer is asking if it will be cheaper without the decorative curls. Ah yes, the bard, the traveling performer, the poet with the treasure, the medieval equivalent of a podcast that no one asked for, but you couldn't turn off because they were staying in your Lord's Hall. Being a bard might sound romantic, but it's really a job that's part musician, part gossip, part court jester, and full-time cold and hungry. You move from place to place with only your instrument, your poems, and a cough that made people suspicious. You sang about kings, battles, and lovers who met a sad end. You also sang about dragons, which were probably just big lizards. People paid to hear these songs because they would learn something, have their curiosity satisfied, or at the very least not get hurt. Every gig was different. One night, you might be singing for rich people in a room full of candles. Next, you would be running away from drunk villagers in a smoky pub when someone shouted, "Play the game where the night gets eaten." You had to do it because the song was worth a lot of money. Your biggest challenge wasn't remembering the lyrics. It was surviving the politics. If you say something bad about the king's hair, you might get killed. The line between clever jokes and insulting people was very thin, and there were a lot of people watching to make sure no one crossed it. You were also expected to learn history by heart. In medieval times, this meant learning whatever the person paying you wanted to be true. Did Sir Godfrey win the battle? It doesn't matter. If he's paying for your dinner, Sir Godfrey did really well. And he was very clean. In the past, bars were known more for their atmosphere than their scent. Lice, fleas, and boots with holes were normal. Your clothes smelled of wood and failure. But you made up for it with charm, wit, and an amazing ability to rhyme sword with board. But you were still in control. You have left a lasting impression on the public. You spread news faster than a town crier with a megaphone. You were like medieval PR, but with more stringed instruments and less shame. Sometimes you'd find great success and become a court bard, living in a noble's house, writing songs for weddings and war campaigns, until you started to think that honor and goner rhymed, and you found yourself back on the road. So, yes, the bard's life was romantic in theory. In practice, it was freezing, itchy, and entirely dependent on your ability to make rhyming couplets quickly. It started with people talking in secret. They said that the sails of the ships were shaped like dragon wings. They also said that the warriors had iron beards and eyes like frozen seas. The Seine had always been very important for Paris, and it was wide, proud, and serene. But in the spring of 845, the river became a warning. The Frankish towns along the coast fell silent one by one. There were no bells ringing, no smoke from the chimneys, just drifting wreckage and blood on the tide. When the news reached Paris, it was clear that the Norsemen would come. It was a question of timing and how bad it would be this time. But this wasn't just any raid. This wasn't a group of people who just wanted to find gold and sheep. This was Ragnar Lobach. To the Franks, his name sounded like thunder cracking through a church roof. Ragnar was a man who claimed to be related to Odin. Ragnar, whose sons would go on to terrify Europe, but who at this moment was very much alive, full of energy, and ready to plunder. With 120 long ships and more than 5,000 warriors supporting him, he didn't sneak towards Paris. He introduced himself. His sails make shadows on the riverbanks. The sound of oars moving through the sand felt like a sign of what was to come. Every monastery and village along the river was looted, burned, or made into slaves. The Franks prayed. Their king, Charles the Bald, tried to build defenses, but his kingdom was already at war with itself. The church really wanted God to come and help them. The nobles argued over which bridge to defend. Meanwhile, Ragnar kept rowing. He didn't need big engines to attack or complicated plans. He had fire, he had fear, and he had time. People in Paris stood on top of their half-finished walls and watched as the river went from a bright color to a dark color as it got closer to death. Mothers hid their children in wine cellars. Priests took control of relics. The king's messengers were sweaty, terrified, and not very clever. They begged neighboring cities for help, but this help never arrived in time. The Norse were no longer just stories told in pubs. They were real, and they were here. Ragnar was in charge, laughing, wild, and ready to make history. You could not mistake them. The river was full of long, narrow boats that moved quickly and smoothly. Their prows were carved into snarling beasts, and their eyes were painted to ward off evil. But this time, the evil was already on the ship. Ragnar's fleet wasn't just a group of fishermen who had decided to become raiders. These were hardened professionals who had spent years fighting in England, Ireland, and the North Sea. Each long ship was a war machine. The men who rowed them measured time by battles and blood. Their shields were arranged neatly along the sides, like a wall of painted death. Behind them stood warriors with braided hair and tattooed arms. Some were wearing chainmail that had been stolen from Frankish corpses. Others were bare-chested and covered in marten ash to intimidate. And it worked. As Ragnar's ships moved up the river, every village and abbey along the way became a rehearsal for the main event. Churches in Paris were set on fire. Men who worked in the church were killed or dragged away in chains. Frankish soldiers who resisted were cut into pieces and thrown into the river. And if the villagers were lucky, they were just robbed. If they didn't, they were killed along with their possessions. Ragnar made sure to leave survivors, not because he was kind, but as a clever plan. He wanted to make sure that Paris knew what he was going to do before he did it. He wanted the city to be filled with fear, and it worked. What made this fleet so scary wasn't just the numbers, it was how well they worked together. These weren't wild people attacking randomly. Ragnar split his forces up like a chess master. Some of them went inland and stole from monasteries like Sandon. Others protected the ships, and the river was always their highway and lifeline. And then, like the music getting louder and louder in a play, they reached the gates of Paris, the capital of the Frankish Empire, which was still recovering from civil wars, famine, and plague, now had to face an army that did not negotiate, but only pillaged. At the city walls, Ragnar ordered the burning of captured Frankish villages that could be seen from the gates. Smoke rose like a dark prophecy. He wasn't just threatening the city, he was challenging them to stop him. And as the flames reflected off the sun and onto his painted sails, Ragnar looked at the stone walls of Paris. He wasn't scared or religious, but he did want to eat. Ragnar found Paris easy. It was a prize. Paris in 845 was not yet the huge fortress it became in later centuries. It was a city on an island, the Ile d'Issy, with 2 wooden bridges and some temporary walls around it. Only a few people defended it, mainly local soldiers, monks with swords, and nobles who were more interested in their titles than in fighting. To put it simply, it was dinner time for Ragnar. The Viking chieftain didn't wait. When he arrived, he launched a careful attack on the outskirts, testing the strength of the defenders. What he found was funny. The Frankish response was disorganized, slow, and showed that they were terrified. So Ragnar pushed forward and laid siege to Paris. He split his forces, surrounding the island from both sides of the river. The sun was as now. Boats can only come in, not go out. The trade was stopped. Food trickled in. Panic spread. Ragnar's men set up campfires all around them. They played dice, drank mead, and sharpened blades. They did all this just a short distance from the city walls. They knew how to wait. The longer the siege, the weaker the prey. Paris tried to resist. Archers were positioned on the bridges. The bells were ringing all the time. Priests held church services 3 times a day, asking for help from God while ignoring the fear in the air. The Franks tried to launch a counterattack from one of the bridges, but it ended in disaster. Ragnar's men pretended to run away, which made the Franks come out into the open where they could be attacked. Bodies floated back to the city. They were bloated and broken. Ragnar always loved a show, and he made things even more exciting. He captured lots of Frankish soldiers in a fight. Instead of holding them for money, he killed them right there on the riverbanks. He left their bodies on display for everyone in Paris to see, as if to say, "Your prayers are meaningless to me." Inside the walls, there was a slow and steady increase in hunger. As time went on, there was less and less food, people's spirits were low, and diseases spread. The people looked to their king, Charles the Bald, but he was not there. He had escaped to safety while his capital city was on fire. And Ragnar, he wasn't even sweating. He was sat by the fire, sharpening an axe, and looking at the smoke coming from the churches he had set on fire. He was smiling. The siege was working. It was becoming a masterpiece. While Paris was suffering from a lack of food and other basic supplies, King Charles the Bold was having a very difficult time. Far away from the danger, he walked, prayed, and felt scared. This wasn't supposed to happen, not on his watch. He was a king of the Carolingians, a family that included Charlemagne, the ruler known for his victories over the pagans. But here he was, being tricked by a non-Christian pirate with good cheekbones and a love of setting things on fire. Charles was having problems. The first was his fractured kingdom. The Frankish Empire had broken into groups that were fighting each other, and Charles's own nobles were not loyal. Every time they asked for more help, they gave excuses. "We're protecting our own lands," or "Good luck, your majesty." No one wanted to send their soldiers into battle against Ragnar's army. The second problem was money, or the lack of it. The treasury was empty because of years of fighting and spending a lot of money on religion. But the worst thing was the humiliation. Paying off Vikings was a dishonorable act. But Charles was running out of options. If Ragnar decided to attack the capital, he would lose his throne. So he tried bargaining. Messengers were sent out with offers of gold, supplies, and even titles if the Vikings would just leave. But Ragnar didn't back down. He didn't want empty promises. He wanted Paris. He was happy to wait until the people inside started eating each other. Then came the big gamble. Charles quickly got together a group of soldiers. They were not a professional army, but a group of fighters with no more than basic training, local nobles, and anyone willing to fight for a bit of money. Their mission is to break the siege and rescue the city. It went exactly as you would expect. Ragnar found out about the plan before the first boot hit the riverbank. His men attacked the relief force near the edge of the city. What happened next was terrible. Charles's reinforcements were killed, forced to retreat, or captured. Those captured were killed in the usual way. Some were used as targets, while others were hung from trees. When he was back in his court, Charles was shocked by the news. He had failed. His army had failed. Paris was out of time. Charles felt ashamed, but he took the last card out of his deck, the bribe. Because when swords fail, gold speaks. In the end, it wasn't faith, fire, or Frankish steel that saved Paris. It was silver. There is lots of silver. Charles the Bald, with no armies and no excuses, did the thing that every ruler is afraid of. He made a deal. It wasn't brave. It wasn't great. It was a matter of survival. And it cost a lot of money. 7,000 levers of silver. That's over 2.5 tons of treasure. It was enough to bankrupt an area, and it made Ragnar laugh. But Charles wasn't negotiating from a strong position. He was negotiating from his knees. His messengers went to Ragnar's camp with shaky hands and bags full of money. There's no fuss, no warnings, just a sad request. Take the silver, leave the city, and give us some dignity. Ragnar, being a professional, didn't brag. Not right away, at least. He listened, looked closely, and probably pretended to think about rejecting the offer to make it more dramatic. But of course, he took it. He hadn't led 5,000 warriors across half of Franche just to knock down some walls. He came for treasure, and the Frankish king had just opened the vault. The handover wasn't a ceremony. It was a business deal. Chest after chest of silver was carried down to the Viking ships. The Franks looked on in silence. The Vikings were very happy. Some people danced while others drank. Some people talked about whether they should take the money and leave the city. But Ragnar, ever the smart one, chose to be well thought of over being greedy. By accepting the ransom and not destroying Paris, he made a stronger message than any torch or axe could. I could break you, but I don't have to. Just pay me. It was an economic war, not a rebellion. The Franks were shocked. Their king had just paid a lot of money to a pagan warlord and let him sail away without being hurt. The religious leaders found the smoke from the incense hard to breathe. The nobles were angry in private, but the people, they were just happy to be alive. The siege ended, the bridges were made clear again, and the fires were put out. And Ragnar, he loaded the silver, raised his sails, and began the journey home, having won the fight, untouched, and paid like a king by a man who actually was one. And behind him, Paris stood smoldering, not in ruins, but in shame, with silver clinking in his hull and smoke curling in the distance. Ragnar turned his longships back down the river, not as a raider fleeing, but as a conqueror departing on his own terms. His warriors sang, their voices echoing off the riverbanks like the final laugh of a villain who got away with everything. Ragnar hadn't just won battle. He had won a myth. As the fleet drifted downstream, they passed the same ruined villages, scorched abysses, and looted monasteries they had ravaged on the way up. Nothing stood in their way. The Franks wouldn't do it, not after what had happened in Paris, not after seeing their king reduced to a checkbook. Some stories say that Ragnar's ship was so full of silver that he had to throw some of it into the river to keep from sinking. Others say he showed the crucified Frankish prisoners as a gift to his enemies. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. Ragnar left Frontier richer, more infamous, and completely unscathed. No one really tried to stop him. Charles the Bold, hurt and angry, did not want to be embarrassed again. And even if he did, he no longer had the resources or the trust of his people to do anything about it. He had paid off the wolf, and now there was a smell of blood on his doorstep. For Ragnar, the journey home was more than just a return. It was a parade to celebrate a victory. His reputation spread rapidly across Europe. To the Norse, he was a real-life legend, proof that the gods favored the bold. The Franks saw him as a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The other Viking leaders now looked to him as the perfect example to follow when it came to raiding. They would burn, terrorize, and then get paid to leave. The emotional hurt was worse than any physical injury. After all, Ragnar hadn't broken into Paris using ladders or siege engines. He broke it with fear, fire, and bravery. And that might have been the most scary part. He could have taken the city, but he didn't need to. As the dragon-headed ships disappeared over the horizon, one thing was very clear. Ragnar Lodbrok had just stolen from one of the most powerful kings in Christendom and sailed away without getting caught. The age of the Vikings was coming to an end. It had arrived. When the dragon ships disappeared and the river was still, Paris did not celebrate. It breathed out slowly and with shaking, like a city waking up from a bad dream. The siege had ended, but the trauma had only just begun. The city is covered in smoke, sweat, and fear that hasn't been washed away. Its bridges were scorched, its churches had been desecrated, and its streets were littered with the bones of people who had tried to resist, but had failed. And while the walls were still standing, the idea of safety had been destroyed. People came out from hiding places with empty eyes, as if they thought the Norse would come back and finish the job. The first thing to return wasn't hope. Everyone was blaming each other. The religious leaders criticized the king for being too scared to take action. The nobles blamed each other for not sending help. The people blamed both. And above it all was the sad truth. Charles the Bald had paid off the enemy and left his capital city to fall apart. They didn't pretend it was a clever move. Everyone knew what it was, a payout made when people were panicking. The church tried to make the survival of Paris seem like a miracle, a test of faith, or a sign that things would get better in the future. But the people knew better. It wasn't angels who had spared them. It was silver. To make matters worse, the ransom had used up all the royal money. Inflation rose. Taxes went up a lot. Monasteries were very sad because their relics had been stolen. The countryside, already tired from years of civil war and famine, became even more exhausted. Every day, the story of Ragnar Lodbrok grew more popular, while the power of the Carolingian throne decreased. The military situation was even worse. Ragnar had shown that the Frankish defenses were not as strong as they seemed. He didn't need tools like catapults or battering rams. All he needed was a river and something to believe in. Other Norse leaders were impressed. If Paris could be taken so easily, what else could be done? And perhaps the most haunting feeling of all was that this wasn't the end. It was the start of something new. It was a warning. Paris had survived, yes, but had also been humiliated, scarred, and forced to buy its own life. That kind of wound doesn't heal quickly. After the smoke had cleared, everyone was left thinking about the same thing. What happened to the broken gates and prayer-stained floors? What will happen when the next Ragnar arrives? The raid on Paris in 845 didn't end when Ragnar sailed home. The truth is, it started something that has lasted much longer. A history of fear, planning, and controlling other cultures that spread across Europe for many years. When the other Viking leaders heard what Ragnar had achieved, they took notes and then set sail. News of the Frankish ransom spread quickly through the north, and with it came a revelation. You didn't have to die gloriously in battle to be remembered. You could die wealthy too. Ragnar had shown that gold was more easily given by frightened kings than by burning cities. Soon, raiders from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began attacking the Saône, the Lyre, and the Rhine. They weren't just careless robbers anymore. They were businessmen who had axes. Viking raids became an annual event in Francia, like grim, blood-stained holidays. Every summer, new fleets arrived, new demands were made, and new ransoms were paid. Ragnar's way of playing became the standard way of playing. Sail quickly, attack hard, scare everyone, and get paid to leave. Cities started collecting silver, not to sell it, but to use it for protection. Monasteries buried their holy relics and relics of saints, not because they were religious, but because they were scared. The Frankish response was to build fortifications and pray. But it wasn't enough. Over time, these raids turned into settlements. First, there were winter camps. Then, there were fortresses. And finally, there were towns. By the end of the 9th century, Norsemen had settled in France, including the area that would become Normandy. It all started with Ragnar's attack on Paris. And Ragnar's fame spread beyond the battlefield. People sang songs and told stories. Some people say that he later attacked the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was thrown into a pit full of snakes, and laughed as he died. Others say he lived out his days in comfort, watching his sons fight in Europe in his name. Whatever the truth, the Viking image of Ragnar, the clever, cruel, unstoppable warlord, was now forever. He was no longer just a man. He was a model. This is an example of how one leader could take advantage of a divided kingdom, overcome its pride, and become a legendary figure. The Viking siege of Paris was not just a success. It was the start of the Vikings' rule. Paris survived, but it would never be the same again. The memory of Ragnar's attack stayed in the minds of the people of the city, in the nightmares of its religious leaders, and in the decisions of every king who came after Charles the Bald. It wasn't just a story, it was a warning. It showed that even the strongest city could be destroyed by a man in a long ship with only fire, determination, and a greedy smile. The Frankish response in the decades that followed was extremely worried. Paris started to make its city stronger by building thicker walls and sturdier bridges, but also by making new rules. The river was watched to see how the boats were moving. Watchtowers were built along the Seine, and the monarchy, hurt and embarrassed, slowly started to be respected again by changing the army and taking control of the country. These hard lessons laid the foundation for the future of France. But the effects of the trauma continued. The name Ragnar was not well known to the average person in Paris. It was personal. Parents used it to scare their kids into listening. Do your chores, or the Northmen will come. Merchants and monks both remembered the screams in the streets, the black smoke, and the silence that followed. As time went on, whenever they saw a foreign ship on the horizon, the old men would say, "They've come back again." But the legacy wasn't all bad. The siege led to a strange cultural exchange, although it was violent. Viking mercenaries would one day serve Frankish kings. The Norse settlers in Normandy became Christian lords. The enemy at the gates would become the knights in the court. It was ironic, almost poetic, that the very culture that once stole from Paris would later defend it. But deep down, the city had changed. Ragnar's attack had made it clear that they weren't invincible. Paris was not untouchable. It had been bought, broken, and then kept to fix it. And the city never forgot that painful lesson. Every archbishop who blessed a sword, every tax collector who weighed a coin, and every soldier who stood guard was acting in the shadow of 845. Because when one man armed only with iron, fire, and courage can make an empire shake and a king pay up, the world notices and the world changes forever. In the Middle Ages, people thought that being good and going to church was the way to be saved. It started with blisters. There was more to being a good Christian than going to church or admitting your sins. Sometimes it meant putting one foot in front of the other and walking for hundreds of miles to visit a holy site. These journeys were called pilgrimages, and they were both deeply spiritual and very physical. Picture a farmer without any shoes walking through rain, snow, and sometimes cow dung, a type of mud, to stand in front of a saint's knuckle bone in a box covered in gold. The reason? The afterlife, or at the very least, God's approval. The church really encouraged people to go on pilgrimages as a way to earn indulgences. Committed adultery, went to Santiago, lied to a priest, tried Canterbury, murdered someone. You could start walking to Jerusalem and keep going. But it wasn't always about feeling bad. Pilgrimage can be a way to show gratitude, ask for healing, or just a chance to leave your village without being called a heretic. For women, it was one of the only ways to travel without being judged. For knights, It was a change from attacking people to show how holy they were. For many people, it was the only holiday they ever went on. The call to pilgrimage came in many forms. It might be a dream, a religious talk, or a local priest saying, God might forgive you if you walk 800 miles with a sore back and no shoes. It wasn't unusual for families to send a representative pilgrim. It's a bit like spiritual outsourcing. One person walking could supposedly earn blessings for the whole clan. They're lucky. Once they had signed up, pilgrims were given a blessing and wore the traditional clothing. They wore a uniform, carried a satchel, and had a badge that was often shaped like a scallop shell or a cross. These symbols marked them as holy wanderers, not vagrants. This was important because they were sleeping in barns and begging for food. But a pilgrimage was not a walk in the countryside. It was a journey full of tiredness, uncertainty, and a small hope that at the end of the road, something amazing would be waiting. That is, if the road didn't kill you first. Before the first step on the dusty road, the medieval pilgrim had a problem to solve. What to bring when you're about to walk 1,000 miles on foot with no Amazon delivery, no waterproof boots, and definitely no snack bars? The answer is as little as possible, but still too much. Pilgrims used a small bag to carry everything they needed. Weight was the problem. If they carried an extra tunic, they had to carry an extra ounce. This was because they had to cross mountains, swamps, and woods full of bandits. They only brought the most important things. You might get a spare linen shift if you're lucky. You could take a bit of dried food, a flask or water skin, and maybe a small religious token to remind you that your suffering was entirely on purpose. Then the staff came. This wasn't for hiking. It was a multifunctional miracle stick. You used it to walk, to defend yourself against wild dogs or wild people, to test the depth of mud pits, and sometimes to prod snoring fellow pilgrims in church. Your hat had to be wide-brimmed to keep you safe from the sun and rain, and it should look like the kind of hat pilgrims wear. It would be even better if it had a scallop shell on it, which is a symbol of the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. That shell could give you access to monasteries, soup kitchens, and free hay in barns. Imagine it's your medieval passport, but it never expires. And everyone knew you were probably poor. But the shoes were a different story. Most pilgrims wore sandals or low-leather shoes, which were not much better than going barefoot. Blisters weren't a possibility. They were a guarantee. Many wrapped their feet in linen and prayed they wouldn't rot before reaching the next shrine. You didn't pack much food. Instead, you had to rely on the kindness of strangers, monasteries, or fellow pilgrims. Kindness might be as simple as sharing a bowl of onion soup with a piece of dry bread. If you were too proud to beg, congratulations. You were also too proud to eat. Maybe the most important thing wasn't even real. A letter of pilgrimage. This document from the church proves you weren't just a vagrant. You needed your holy permission slip to avoid going to jail and go to heaven. The pilgrims set out, feeling tired and carrying a heavy bag, and quietly prayed. When you're getting ready for the afterlife, you can't take everything with you. When you left the safety of your village in medieval Europe, you were faced with the unknown world of travel. The road was unpredictable, and it didn't care about your prayers. Let's start with the land. Medieval roads were not like the roads we know today. They were either nice, clean paths or muddy, dangerous paths, depending on the weather. Rain turned everything into soup. Snow hid wolves. In summer, the sun cooked your skin and attracted every biting insect from Normandy to Jerusalem. There were always bandits around. Pilgrims were easy targets. They were unarmed, poorly fed, and often carrying small amounts of coin or religious trinkets that could be sold. A pilgrim walking alone was basically a donation box that could walk. Even traveling in groups wasn't always safe. Some of the thieves dressed as fellow pilgrims to blend in. If you get robbed by a guy wearing the same scallop shell as you, that's a pretty clear sign of betrayal. Then there were the animals. Wolves, Bears and wild boars are just some of the creatures that could easily eat you alive. Dogs roamed freely and were less friendly and more territorial. They had mange. If you go the wrong way through the woods, you won't just be lost, you'll be in danger. But the biggest danger of all was temptation. Pilgrimage routes often had taverns, brothels, and gambling pits, especially near large towns. Some pilgrims never made it past the first city before their promise to be good turned into a haze of alcohol, gambling, and regret. The church disapproved, of course, but the people who owned the pub were very happy to see you become a drunk. Even the other people you're traveling with could be a problem. There were dishonest people, people who took advantage of others, and people who claimed to be prophets and asked for food in exchange for strange visions. People argued about where to sleep, how to find a toilet, and who smelt worse. You could be halfway to Rome and suddenly find yourself in a heated debate about the Virgin Mary with a fisherman from Flanders who has no shoes on. But most people carried on walking. The journey was a test of endurance and a spiritual challenge. Every muddy mile, every wolf howling in the distance, every temptation resisted or shamefully indulged, it all became part of the story, part of the sacrifice. Because you couldn't earn holiness inside the cathedral, you could only earn it by working hard in the mud. After a long time, the pilgrim finally saw it. Rising above the hills, a spire, a dome, or a shining shrine, the holy site, the place where miracles supposedly happened. And it was usually smaller than expected. This was true of the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, the bones of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, and a suspiciously well-preserved toe of St. Margaret somewhere in France. The destination changed, but the atmosphere stayed the same. It's all just a big deal. These places were like Disneyland, but medieval. Instead of roller coasters, there were sacred relics, candlelit processions, and sometimes exorcisms. The relics themselves were the main attraction. But let's be honest, medieval Europe had a bit of a problem with too many relics. There were enough pieces of the true cross to build a forest. Everyone claimed to have the skull of John the Baptist, and sometimes there would be 3 of them in the same city. But being real wasn't really the point. Belief was. Pilgrims would crawl on their knees to reach the relic. Some people cried, and others passed out. Many people touched the shrine and quietly prayed. Heal my blindness. Forgive me for being unfaithful. Make my back stop aching. People thought that saints had special powers and that their bones could still perform miracles, like medieval vending machines. And where there were miracles, there was money. Towns built around these shrines made a lot of money. Inns, taverns, trinket sellers, and monks offering special blessings at very high prices thrived. You could buy candles, holy water, amulets, and even tiny flasks that were said to be filled with saintly sweat. If you pay the right price, you could be forgiven quickly. The church was supportive of this. Pilgrimage sites made people want to visit, which brought money and prestige. Cathedrals were built just to house a single toe or dried-up tunic. And the more dramatic the story behind the relic, the more people will want to see it. Bleeding statues, check. Bodies that cannot be corrupted. Totally. Talking skulls. Someone definitely claimed it. But even in the middle of all that, many pilgrims felt really amazed. Surviving the tough journey felt like arriving at heaven when I stood in front of a golden relic in the dark. It might not have looked like much, but to someone who was tired, that shrine was very important. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey. It was a big deal. Every step a pilgrim took meant money changing hands. People who ran inns, taverns, blacksmiths, shops selling religious items, and even beggars all depended on the money given to them by pilgrims. When hundreds or even thousands of pilgrims came to a town each year, the local economy did really well. It did really well. This is what is known as the pilgrim trap. A village with an average shrine might suddenly have a vision, a miracle, or a goat giving birth with a mark like a crucifix on its side. Suddenly, a chapel appeared, candles were lit, and someone was charging 3 denarii for a look at a finger bone that was said to belong to a saint. Tourists came, merchants followed, and the church got some money from the offerings. Of course, the most profitable sites like Santiago de Compostela became pilgrimage megahubs. Entire industries popped up. People who made cloaks for travelers, people who repaired shoes, and bakers who made dry, long-lasting bread. You could even find medieval pilgrim guides, men who promised protection and directions for a price. Sometimes they were fair. Sometimes they were just well-dressed robbers working for a company. Merchants sold lots of souvenirs. Pilgrims wore little tin badges shaped like the shrine's relic. These badges showed where the pilgrims had been, like medieval travel stickers. You could even buy a fake one if you didn't want to walk the whole way. Monasteries also played a big part. These places were not at all spiritual retreats. They were actually places where people came to be served. Monks would welcome pilgrims with beds and bowls of soup, but they would also ask for a donation. Some of them were really kind. Others were good at setting the right price. And then there were the scammers, fake relics, staged miracles, fake monks, and holy men who claimed to be divine but really just wanted your money. Pilgrims had to be careful not to be too serious or they might have made a mistake. Even so, most people took part because they wanted to. They knew how to play the game. They were involved. And after all, wasn't their own salvation worth a few coins? In the end, the road to heaven might have been lined with prayer, but it was paved with silver. Even though it was lonely, most pilgrims did not walk alone. It was safer to be in a group. Groups of people naturally formed. These groups might be people from the same village, people who were traveling in the same direction, or people who had the same injury and the same goal. It was like a medieval backpacker hostel. The bands were chaotic, noisy, and weirdly intimate. They were never boring. The group's behavior was somewhere between touching and total chaos. One day, you were eating crusty bread under a tree. The next thing you know, you're yelling at someone for stealing your turnip. People of all kinds came on pilgrimage. Everyone from nobles to criminals, peasants to merchants, and widows to monks. What could possibly go wrong? The language barrier made things even harder. A German pilgrim might walk with an English farmer and a Breton nun. The result was lots of pointing, mimicking, and sometimes fights about who got to sleep in the dry spot under the eaves of a barn. People often argued over things like food, pace, and whose relic badge was shinier. Some people decided to take a vow of silence, which helped until someone tripped over their bag and broke a flask of holy water. Then I felt like I didn't have to keep my promises. But even when they were arguing, something more deep-seated was often happening. Friendship. When you share a road with mud, illness, and fear, it makes you realize what is really important in life. You laughed at the same silly things. You looked after each other when someone got sick. You prayed together when wolves howled too close. You cried when someone died along the route, which happened far more often than people like to admit. There were also moments of strange joy, people singing and telling stories around a fire, kind acts from strangers, a shared loaf, a dry cloak, or a hand on a shoulder at a shrine. It wasn't all bad. Some pilgrims said the best part was the fellowship. Many returned home with new friends, letters from foreign places, or stories about that one Italian guy who could juggle knives and recite psalms. Others left quietly, taking a different path with a quick goodbye and a prayer. Because on the pilgrim road, people came and went like clouds, but the journey always kept moving forward. Some of the pilgrims weren't as pure in their intentions as they could have been. Many people set off on their journeys with good intentions, such as wanting to repent, seek healing, or make a fresh start. But the medieval world, like our own, was full of contradictions. And there was no better place to see the funny side of religious devotion and pride than on the pilgrimage trail. Some pilgrims were more interested in how other people saw them than in the reasons for their journey. These were the people who made sure everyone knew how far they'd come, how much they'd suffered, and how often they'd prayed on a single loaf of moldy bread. You don't have to be humble, but you do need to be dramatic. Then, fashion lovers started to arrive. Yes, really. Rich nobles often dressed up as ordinary travelers, but with fancy cloaks, special staff with decorations, and bags that were sewn with embroidery. They would hire servants to carry their luggage, and sometimes even ride horses for most of the journey. Spiritual suffering is made easier with a portable feather mattress. While most pilgrims walked the whole way, others found shortcuts, both physical and spiritual. Some people paid for carriages to take them from one place to another, while others carried them. Some people just bought pilgrimage badges at the market and didn't go on the trip at all. Why take the risk of facing wolves and opposition when you can just pretend with a shiny tin can and a good lie? But being unfaithful in a spiritual way had consequences. The church did not like people it thought were fake pilgrims. Some towns even had guards on the main pilgrimage roads to check documents and make sure people were going the right way. But the law was not always enforced, and there were many loopholes. As long as you rang the right bells and put the right coins in the collection box, no one asked questions. But even among the people who were dishonest and those who were showy, there was still a real sense of religious devotion. Many pilgrims said their prayers every day, walked barefoot, or put themselves through a lot of discomfort for the sake of their souls. Some people even carried heavy crosses or whipped themselves. Others walked in silence or gave up meat, wine, or even speech until they reached their holy goal. The line between devotion and display was thin and often crossed by muddy feet and human nature. Pilgrimage isn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, limping, sweaty, occasionally lying about your blisters, but still walking the road. In the end, all the pilgrimages ended, either at a holy place, a grave, or for the lucky ones, back home. But coming home wasn't always the happy return people thought it would be. First, there were the physical realities. Most pilgrims came back with fewer teeth, fewer coins, and many more scars, both physical and emotional. Their feet were permanently mangled, their backs hunched, and some had strange illnesses with names no village healer could pronounce. You didn't just bring home a badge. You brought home some injuries and stories of a Flemish man who snored very loudly. Then came the expectations. Villages often greeted returning pilgrims with a special ceremony. You were supposed to be more spiritual, more wise, and more calm. People expected you to pray more, sin less, and maybe smell like frankincense. Instead, many pilgrims stumbled home hungry, annoyed, and more interested in beer than blessings. Some people were disappointed. They had walked hundreds of miles, touched the bones of a saint, cried at the altar, and nothing had changed. There is no miracle and no voice from God. Their disease stayed the same. They felt guilty. The only thing that felt lighter was their wallet. For these pilgrims, it was a big letdown. Others, however, came back changed. It wasn't because of the relics or rituals, but because of the journey itself. They walked every day, met new people, and saw faraway lands. It changed how they saw the world. Some of them became storytellers. Some people decided to become monks or nuns. Others just got used to living with noisy chickens. The road taught them humility, empathy, and endurance in a way that no sermon ever could. And let's not forget the bragging rights. People wore their pilgrimage badges like armor in the village tavern. A tin scallop shell from Santiago that was worth a free drink. A piece of fabric from Jerusalem. You would keep on telling that story until the day you died. Whether the journey had changed your soul or not, it definitely made you more well-known. Even those who had cheated or not finished the journey found a strange kind of peace in trying. The attempt itself became the offering. In the Middle Ages, going on a pilgrimage meant one thing. You had dared to walk the road to heaven and somehow made it back. Even though hundreds of years have passed and planes have replaced blistered feet, the effects of medieval pilgrimages are still felt around the world. In the past, going on a pilgrimage was more than just a personal trip. It was a driving force for the local culture. Important medieval routes like the Camino de Santiago, the Via Francigena, and the road to Canterbury helped medieval Europe come together. Pilgrims crossed borders, shared stories, swapped dialects, and accidentally built the foundation for something revolutionary. We all have the same European identity. Roads improved because of the pilgrims. Hospitals and hostels were built for them. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Commerce followed the pilgrims' dusty boots and stayed in the area for a long time, even after they had gone. Today, many modern highways follow the same routes that thousands of people walked in medieval times. Spiritually, pilgrimage changed how people understood faith. In the past, salvation was only available to those who went to church and said prayers in Latin. But going on pilgrimage made it more real. You could walk towards it. You could suffer for it. You could earn it 1 mile at a time. But the legacy wasn't just physical or spiritual. It was very human. The Pilgrim's Road became a symbol of the struggle to improve and the painful, sometimes ridiculous, process of trying to become better. It was never about being perfect. It was about movement, about intention, about showing up muddy, flawed, and hopeful. Today, people still walk those same ancient routes. Some people do it to get fit, some for fun, and some because they have lost something or someone and need time to deal with that. You can still see the scallop shell on backpacks and walking sticks. The people who work at the trail side still welcome the footsaw. People might be whispering prayers in different languages now, but they're still going up into the sky above the same dusty roads. Even people who've never done a pilgrimage can feel its importance in our culture in books, films, and even on social media, where we watch someone try to find themselves by leaving everything behind. The medieval pilgrimage was about becoming, not just arriving. The legacy of the movement continues, not in the shrines, but in the choice to keep walking. Even when the road is long, the shoes don't fit, and it feels like the miracles are far away. Maybe the real relic wasn't a saint's bone in a box. It was the pilgrim who came back home, still hurt, but still going. In a world without weekend football matches or celebrity boxing, the medieval tournament was the ultimate event. The arrival of an official tournament proclamation was very exciting for the noble class. It is sealed with wax, has a fancy design, and is delivered by a herald on horseback. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a public challenge. If you were a night owl, your honor practically required you to show up and be thrown off a horse. Tournaments didn't just happen. They were planned like a royal wedding and paid for by a small war. Local lords or powerful kings and queens hosted them to show off how rich they were, attract allies, and maybe marry off 1 or 2 of their daughters. People would set aside days, sometimes weeks, for feasting, jousting, fighting, archery, parades, and chaos. For the knights who received these invitations, the stakes were high. Tournaments were where people's reputations were made or damaged, and sometimes people even ended up with broken bones. It was a chance to show off their skills, bravery, and sense of style, with the ladies, lords, and rival knights watching on. If you won, you might get married, given land, or even have a poem written about you by someone who has won a prize. But not everyone was invited. You had to be born into a noble family, or at least act like one. The family crest was checked, and the family history was discussed. No one wanted a commoner sneaking in with a fake coat of arms. If he had one, people would have been very shocked. Preparation began immediately. The armor was polished. Horses were trained. Tailor was called. A knight didn't just need to fight well. He had to look the part. Your coat needed to shine. Your family crest had to be clearly visible from 50 paces away, and your lance had to be balanced to the ounce. People also heard rumors about rivalries when they received the invitation. Had Sir Baldwin insulted Sir Geoffrey's sister at the last tournament? Was Sir Roland still angry about being unhorsed by a younger knight with better hair? These scores would be settled with the sound of horses' hooves and the noise of weapons. The moment that wax seal cracked, the energy of the night started to build. Because the tournament wasn't just a game. It was like a war, but on a polite level. After the tournament was announced, the real work began. And for the knights, that meant training. The training is brutal, relentless, and often a little crazy. Even though tournaments involve pageantry and ceremony, they were essentially organized fights on horseback. If you weren't prepared, you wouldn't stand a chance. You were going to eat dirt in front of 1,000 people and possibly a member of the royal family. First, the joust, the famous event. 2 knights fighting with all their might, lances down, trying to knock each other off their feet. But hitting the target wasn't as easy as running at full speed. It took hours of drilling. Knights practiced against wooden targets, which had shields on one side and a heavy sandbag on the other. If you don't hit the shield hard enough, you'll fail. If you hit the sandbag in the wrong place, it could swing around and hit you on the head. This is a great way to stay motivated. Balance was the most important thing. You had to aim a 12-foot lance at a moving target while riding a horse wearing 36 kilograms of armor without falling off. Training involves making the stomach muscle stronger, getting the timing right, and getting to know your horse so well that you practically read each other's minds. If your horse is scared or tired, it might mess up your shot and even break your leg. Off the horse, knights practiced with swords, axes, and maces to get ready for the big fight. It's basically a fight between teams, with fewer rules and more bruises. This was the part of the tournament that simulated real battles. These battles could last for hours and involve dozens of fighters. They often ended with injuries like dislocated shoulders and shattered noses, or with noblemen being dragged out of the mud by their squires. They also trained squires. They were responsible for everything: moving heavy armor, looking after horses, giving out weapons in the middle of a fight, and using a mixture of herbs and panic to treat wounds. A good squire could mean the difference between glory and humiliation. If you're in the wrong situation, you might accidentally take the wrong sword. Oops. Training was tiring, risky, and sometimes it ended in death. But knights accepted it as part of the code of conduct. You didn't just train to win, you trained to survive. Even though the songs made tournaments sound romantic, they weren't. They were places where people fought and where there were rules about what you could and couldn't wear. Even before lances were smashed, tournaments were a place where people showed off their skills. Knights didn't just arrive, they made a big entrance. Everything from their coats to the embroidery on their horse blankets made it clear that they were important people. You weren't just a fighter. You were a walking family brand. Your colors, symbols, and outfit choices were more powerful than any war cry. The main focus of this event was heraldry. It's like a medieval version of a CV, Instagram profile, and sports jersey all in one. Shields and banners displayed the family crest. Lions for courage, crosses for piety, and mythical beasts for those who clearly had something to prove. Every color and pattern had meaning. Red is for bravery, gold is for generosity, and black is for sadness or revenge. Or maybe you just liked the way it looked when the sunlight hit it. These symbols weren't just for show. They helped identify knights by looking under layers of armor. You might be wearing a helmet, a visor, and you might be hidden in the dust of the joust. but your heraldic device told everyone who was being honored, and more importantly, whose reputation was being raised or ruined in front of the crowd. And oh, the crowd. Tournaments were like public theater. Everyone was waiting to see who looked like a hero. There were nobles, people from the town, visiting merchants, and people who were looking for a romantic partner. Knights often paid tailors to design beautiful clothes for them. That's fancy horse armor, in case you don't know much about medieval fashion. Bright colors, glittering threads, and detailed embroidery made the list look like a runway of chain mail and confidence. But it wasn't just about personal branding. It was a political decision. Your clothes showed who you were friends with, who your patron was, and where you dined. A knight might wear his lady's scarf tied to his arm, showing his devotion to her and his social status. Others showed off foreign styles to prove they had fought in exotic places. Silk from the East meant that someone was a crusader. These fur-lined gloves probably just looked good. Armor was also part of the fashion game. It was more than just a practical object. It was custom-made and often decorated with precious metals. A rich knight might enter the battlefield looking impressive, while a poorer one just hoped his dented helmet didn't fall off mid-charge. In the world of the tournament, it was very important to look good. It was a strategy. Before any fighting started, there was a grand entrance with flags and music that made royal coronations look like barbecues. This was the grand procession, a parade of people with big egos, armor, and flags. It was meant to impress, intimidate, and charm the crowd watching. The knights rode in a single file line. They had banners fluttering in the wind, and their horses were decorated with flowing garlands. Squires ran behind them, looking stressed. The heralds announced each knight's name, and sometimes added their own comments, like victor of 3 past tournaments, or he who once split a man's helmet clean in half. Modesty was not the mood. The judges watched from their fancy seats, thinking about who would be the best. Noble lords looked at potential allies or rivals, and among the cheering villagers, people were already making bets. Sir Geoffrey, would you like to go on the horse again? Would someone fall off their horse in the first part of the race? You never knew, and that was half the fun. After the parade, the new officers took their oaths. In the tournament, knights took turns in front of the judge. The judge was a noble, or even a king or queen. The knights promised to follow the code of chivalry. This meant that you couldn't hit a man who had lost his helmet, you couldn't attack from behind, and you absolutely couldn't stab your opponent once he was already on the ground. You know, the basics of not being crazy. These oaths weren't just for show. They were public declarations of honor. Breaking the rules could lead to fines, being disqualified, or even being the subject of a very unflattering song. But let's be honest, while many knights meant every word, others were already thinking of ways to get out of their promises. I promise not to hurt anyone unless they insult my horse. Some tournaments made the ritual more exciting. Knights might promise to be loyal to a lady, dedicate their performance to a saint, or make a personal vow, like never retreating or never eating until they win. Romantic? Yes, it's completely reckless. Usually, the parade and pledges get things started. They made knights into characters, rivals into stories, and the arena into a living story. This wasn't just a sport for the medieval audience. It was like a play with choreographed fighting and a message about right and wrong, and the costumes were really expensive. This was the main event. As soon as everyone quieted down, the trumpets sounded, and 2 knights started running towards each other as fast as they could with wooden poles. They hoped not to become medieval mulch. The joust wasn't just the best part of the tournament. It was the stuff of legend, with splinters and occasional skull fractures. The arena, or tilt yard, was divided by a long wooden barrier called the tilt, which was designed to prevent horses from crashing into each other head-on. On both sides, knights lined up on horseback, each wearing armor like a walking cathedral, helmets that were tightened tightly, visors lowered, and lances held upright. Then, after a blast of trumpet and a cry from the herald, they charged. The goal? Hit your opponent directly on their shield, chest, or helmet. If you hit your lance in the right place, it could break into a bunch of pieces, which would get you cheers from the crowd and higher scores from the judges. The best way to win was to make your opponent lose their horse. But be careful, this was dangerous. Lances were blunt, yes, but bluntwood doesn't feel soft when it's going 30 miles per hour into your sternum. Injuries were common. People got broken arms, shattered ribs, concussions, and teeth that got knocked so far back they became relics. Helmets were dented in like ale cups. One unlucky knight was impaled through the ice. The accident made the armor regulations even stricter. But even though there were risks, knights kept coming back. Jousting wasn't just about honor, it was also about status. If they won, they could become famous right away. Nobles might offer to support you. Ladies might offer favors. You might even get your name in a song about you. And if you were a knight without land to call their own, looking for a way to become more powerful, a few good battles might be the way to do it. But jousting wasn't just about who was stronger. It was a test of how well you could ride, how well you could judge the pace, and how well you could control your horse. If you made a mistake, you would fly sideways, feeling ashamed and dirty. Jousting was the most important part of Celtic culture, even though it could be dangerous, because for a real knight, there was nothing more exciting than being thrown off a horse in front of the person you had a crush on. If the joust was a display of skill, the melee was a medieval brawl with weapons. Imagine a game where you and your team are trying to survive against a group of enemies. There were lots of knights split into two groups. They charged at each other in a big field. They had swords, axes, and maces. They were very excited, like people who fight in pubs. There were rules, but they were more like suggestions. For example, the commandment, "Do not kill," is more of a gentle reminder. The melee was meant to recreate real battlefield conditions, but without the arrows and screaming people. Knights fought in groups or on their own, on horseback or on foot, and often in rounds that lasted until someone called it off or until the last man standing couldn't. The objectives were different. Sometimes it was just a total free-for-all. Other times, teams fought to capture a flag, a banner, or a token, or to rescue a dummy representing a lady in distress, chivalry. Remember? While jousting was more glamorous, the melee offered knights a different kind of fame. It showed how strong, fit, and clever they were. You could show off your sword skills, your horsemanship, and your ability to survive being hit over and over by other men in armor. It was wonderful. It was tiring and risky. Injuries were bound to happen. Helmets cracked, shields broke, bones snapped. Some battles were so violent that knights were dragged out of the fight, knocked out, or didn't get up at all. But as long as nobody died on purpose, it was all part of the game. Squires hurried in and out, like pit crew, handing out replacement weapons, pulling fallen knights from the mud, or moving horses away from the fighting. And all the while, nobles and ladies watched from shaded pavilions, drinking wine and cheering on their favorite contestants. After all, what better way to show romance than by watching someone get elbowed in the helmet? 4 knights without land and younger sons. The fight was a great chance to get ahead. If you don't want to joust, you might do better in the chaos. If you win, you could win money, armor, and even a noble sponsor. If you lost, you might get bruises and limp for a few weeks while you prayed for pain relief. But in a world obsessed with honor and spectacle, it was in the melee that true grit showed. There's nothing quite as satisfying as beating your enemies with a stick and looking good doing it. Let's be honest, part of why knights put themselves through bruised ribs and shattered egos was for the glory. But the women were watching too. Tournaments weren't just war games. They were social stages. Knights knew that their every move could win them more than just money. It could win you favor, admiration, or even a marriage proposal. And no part of the tournament was better for flirting and performance than the moments between fights. Noble women didn't just sit in the stands looking pretty. They took part in the pageantry. Many knights would dedicate their performance to a lady they were in love with. Sometimes they tied a scarf, veil, or token from her hand to their lance to show how devoted they were. This wasn't just sweet, it was planned. If the knight did well, the lady shared the glory. If he was horrified, well, at least she didn't promise that she would be his only girlfriend. Ladies were also given prizes. The winner gets garlands, rings, or a kiss on the cheek. The crowd loved it. These courtly rituals encouraged people to be chivalrous, fighting for love and beauty, and for something better than just pride. It also helped that the beautiful woman was sitting in a velvet building with servants and luxury while you were sweating into a steel bucket. But love at tournaments wasn't always innocent. Romantic relationships blossomed. Secret notes were passed around. Nobles liked to gossip. Some knights made a living out of tricking rich women by pretending to be chivalrous. The church was very unhappy about it, but that never stopped anyone. And then there were the poets. Minstrels and troubadours traveled from tournament to tournament, turning heroic deeds and romantic disasters into rhyming performances. If you won the jousting competition and also won the heart of a duchess, people might sing about you for years. If you fell off your horse trying to impress a baroness, that also made it into the ballads, just with more laughter. In a society where status was everything, being admired by noble women could make or break a knight's reputation. A kind word from the right person can have more effect than money. Because in the eyes of the public, love wasn't just a battlefield. It was part of the tournament. Even though they made lots of promises and behaved like knights, tournaments were actually pretty chaotic. Under the shiny armor and flags, there was a whole world of scandal, cheating, and chaos. Let's start with the cheating. Knights were supposed to follow the rules. Don't hit an opponent who can't defend themselves. Don't hit them very hard. Don't play unfairly. But honor had a strange way of disappearing when money and reputation were involved. Some competitors secretly make their lances stronger by adding metal cores, which makes them much more dangerous and much less breakable. Others tampered with their armor, either removing padding to make them more agile or deliberately dulling their opponent's blade before a match. And if a knight wanted to get even, it was common for them to accidentally hurt someone in the lists. Officials tried to make sure everyone behaved. Marshals walked around the fields. Heralds recorded the hits, and disagreements were sometimes settled in front of important judges. But bribes worked really well. If the accused knight had enough money and friends, they might be able to get the punishment reduced. Then came the accidents, which were often just as bad as the cheating. Lances broke in ways they weren't meant to. Helmets went flying off. Horses collapsed. One knight, he famously died instantly after being hit by a lance splinter through the ice. Another fell so hard he bit his tongue in half and was unable to speak for life. These are not just random outliers. They were prepared to take risks, and the knights knew it. But the crowd was most excited by a public scandal. Rivalries got personal. There were violent fights in the camps after dark. There were secret relationships between knights and noble women, stolen prizes, and people switching identities. We know of at least one woman who disguised herself as a knight to compete. When her actions were discovered, she was kicked off the lists, but not before winning 2 matches and embarrassing half a dozen noblemen. Clerics did not like what they saw. They said that tournaments encouraged vanity, violence, and sin. They weren't wrong, but people ignored them because the nobility loved the drama, the people loved the blood, and knights loved the chance to play hero until someone's visor caved in. The truth is, even though it might have seemed that way, the tournament was never just about honor. It was a very exciting game where cheating, blood, and gossip were all part of the fun. By the late Middle Ages, tournaments had changed from being rough and tumble war rehearsals into big shows. It's more like a show than a proper training session, and more like a beauty contest than a real challenge. What started as practice for knights turned into a kind of medieval celebrity circuit. And like all great entertainment, it changed over time. In the past, tournaments were chaotic battles meant to copy real combat. Knights practiced the skills they would need in a war. They charge together, avoid arrows, and break through skulls. But as the rules of the game changed, so did the tournament. Plate armor became heavier, swords more ceremonial, and lances blunter. The event changed from being about how well soldiers could fight to how well they could perform. By the 14th and 15th centuries, tournaments were more like a royal Broadway show. The costumes were very detailed, with painted shields and custom-made armor that was decorated with saints and the house's emblem. The nobles watching from the stands weren't looking for a difficult survival. They wanted a good show. Imagine a version of WWE with chainmail. Kings and queens started hosting tournaments more for diplomatic reasons than for military readiness. It was a way to show off how rich you were, make friends with other people, and impress visitors from abroad. Henry VIII of England, for example, absolutely loved tournaments, especially when he was the one doing the jousting. But a head injury from a really bad tilt could have changed his personality forever. Oops. But as gunpowder was used on the battlefield and the age of chivalric knights ended, the tournament also became less important. Firearms made armor useless. Mounted charges became less common. And being thrown off a horse by your cousin just wasn't enough to prepare you for the sound of cannon fire. But the effects of the tournament were still being felt. It created symbols that have lasted for a long time. The knight, the girl, the shining armor. It had a big impact on literature, from the legends of Arthur to Shakespeare's dramas. Even today, you can still hear the echoes of the past. Renaissance fairs, jousting reenactments, and fantasy fiction filled with noble jewels and elaborate tournaments. Whenever someone in a story uses a lance to fight an opponent in front of excited crowds, they're taking inspiration from this medieval tradition. The tournament may no longer be the main event, but its impact is still clear. It mixed violence with honor, chaos with choreography, and turned battlefield brutality into entertainment. Because in the end, the medieval tournament wasn't just about training knights. It was about creating legends with a bit of blood, a touch of scandal, and a lot of style.